Two black girls, shivering in the night, had lost everything, their mother, their home, their safety. With nowhere else to go, they stood before the mansion of a billionaire who never thought his world would collide with theirs. When one of the sisters pleaded, "Our mom died, please help us," it stopped him cold. What happened next would break hearts, expose hidden truths, and redefine what family really means. Stay with us to the very end, because this story will leave you breathless, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Chicago was locked in the grip of a bitter February storm. The streets howled with a mix of lake wind and icy grit, the kind of cold that gnawed through layers of wool and steel alike. On Wabash Avenue, most of the city hurried by with heads down, fighting toward destinations that promised warmth. But one man walked deliberately, shoulders squared, his world paced by timetables and contracts rather than weather. Adrian Cole had built a life around control. Billionaire developer, architect of skylines, the man whose signature could raise towers where there had once been empty lots. Even his morning was arranged with military precision, breakfast with investors, a press call, and a private jet waiting to carry him south to Houston where another deal, another conquest, awaited. He had always moved through the city like it was a chessboard designed for him alone. That was the way you survived in his world. That was the way you survived after loss. As he reached the gleaming doors of the Cole Tower, the crown jewel of his empire, he felt only the usual chill of Chicago's winters. But just before he pulled open the heavy glass, a sound cut through the storm. A voice, young and steady despite the cold. "Mr. Cole?" He turned, surprised. There, against the backdrop of swirling snow and neon haze, stood two children. The older was a girl, perhaps 9, her coat too thin and torn at the sleeve. She held herself upright, not with arrogance, but with the tense posture of someone who had learned that standing straight was a shield against pity. Beside her clung a much smaller girl, maybe 5 or 6, whose mittenless hands gripped a ragged stuffed rabbit like it was the last warm thing in the world. Adrian blinked, his hand still on the tower door. People passed without stopping. The valet shifted uncomfortably, trying not to look. The doorman pretended to polish a brass handle. The girl spoke again, her words clipped and careful, as though she had rehearsed them many times but still feared they might collapse if spoken too softly. "My mama died this morning. We don't have anywhere to go. She said if anything happened we should find you. She said you'd help." Her words struck him harder than the wind. He studied her face and realized she wasn't pleading. She was simply stating fact. She was a child reporting the collapse of her world with the clarity of someone who had already been taught that no one would believe her tears. Adrian asked the most practical question that came to his lips. "What's your name?" The older child lifted her chin. "Layla. And this is my sister, Zuri. How did you get here?" Layla's answer was as simple as it was devastating. "We walked." Adrian thought of the distance across the city, through alleys glazed with ice and streets thick with exhaust. He thought of the weather warnings he had ignored this morning, confident his driver and heated car would shield him. He thought of these children braving that same storm on foot, their breath fogging in the dark. Every rational instinct screamed for him to step back. Call the police, call child services, call someone who was employed to handle broken lives. This wasn't his problem. This wasn't his role. But as he looked at them, he felt another truth stirring, one he had buried so deep it had grown unfamiliar, the memory of Owen. Owen had been 9 too, the same age as Layla, 9 years old when a freak accident on a lake outing took his life. 9 years old when Adrian, unable to face the guilt and chaos, buried not only his son but also the softer parts of himself. For years afterward, he lived by contracts and numbers, refusing to feel what could not be controlled. He learned to walk past the cries of others, to seal himself away in glass and steel where grief could not touch him. And yet here was a girl, the same age Owen had been, standing in the storm asking him to prove that he still knew the difference between right and wrong. He could have turned, he could have walked inside and told himself it was tragic but not his responsibility. But some doors, once opened in life, cannot be shut again. "Come inside," Adrian said finally, his voice lower than he intended. "Both of you." The girls followed him into the marble lobby, their small boots leaving a trail of melted snow on the polished floor. The air was rich with heat, the scent of leather and wood polish rising to meet them. For a moment, the building felt less like a monument and more like an ark. He guided them past the lobby's sculptures into a quiet executive lounge where a fire could be summoned with the flick of a switch. Flames leapt obediently, reflecting in the vast windows, and for the first time that day, color returned to the children's faces. Adrian poured orange juice from a carafe and set it in front of them. Zuri wrapped both hands around the glass, as though afraid it might vanish, sipping slowly like every drop was a treasure. Layla did not drink immediately. She studied the room, the man, the fire, measuring whether any of it was real. At last she said, with that same unnerving steadiness, "My mother used to clean offices in this tower. She said you once smiled at her in the hallway. She said you still knew right from wrong." Adrian froze. He had no memory of this woman, no recollection of her face, but her daughter's words landed like a verdict. The children had not come here by mistake. Their mother had trusted him. On the strength of a smile, perhaps the only kindness she had noticed in a building where most people walked past her as though invisible. The weight of that trust pressed on him now. "Where is she?" he asked quietly. Layla answered without hesitation. "At home, on the couch." Still, the bluntness of it staggered him. She had carried her mother's death across the city, not as a tragedy, but as a fact she needed someone to acknowledge. Adrian moved quickly then. He called down to the kitchen for food, grilled cheese, tomato soup, warm bread, and then made another call, one he never thought he would make. Child Protective Services. The voice that answered was Patricia Alvarez, a caseworker he knew by reputation. Patricia arrived within the hour. She was a woman seasoned by years of walking into chaos, her clipboard tucked under one arm, her expression both firm and kind. She crouched to speak with the sisters, her voice low and reassuring, asking their ages, their school, their relatives. When she turned to Adrian, her tone was procedural. "By law, these girls must be placed immediately. We'll do everything possible to keep them together, but there are no guarantees." Something shifted in Adrian then. He had walked away from Owen once, walked away from the wreckage of his own family because the pain was too much to face. But he could not walk away from these girls. "They stay together," he said firmly, "and they stay with me. I'll take responsibility." Patricia straightened. "That's not how it works, Mr. Cole. Guardianship requires a petition, a process." "Then explain the process," Adrian interrupted. "Tell me what requires money and what requires time." "I have both." Patricia studied him. For a moment she looked skeptical, but then she saw the way Layla's eyes stayed fixed on Adrian, as though she had already decided he was the last safe harbor left in the city. Finally, Patricia nodded. "There's a petition for emergency guardianship. It's temporary, but it buys us time. I'll start the paperwork." Adrian called another name, one he had not spoken aloud in months. Serena Vaughn, his attorney. She was a sharp mind and sharper voice, the woman who had defended him in boardrooms but had never been asked to defend his humanity. When she answered, he simply said, "I need you downtown. It's about 2 girls who deserve better than the sentence life gave them this morning." By the time the food arrived, hot, fragrant, comforting in its simplicity, the girls were eating like survivors of a siege. Zuri smiled faintly as the warmth reached her cheeks, and Layla at last allowed herself to lean back in her chair. Adrian canceled his flight. The jet would leave without him, and for once, he didn't care. That night, as the tower lights glowed against the storm outside, he sat in silence across from 2 girls who had arrived with nothing but a rabbit and a mother's last instruction. On the pad before him, he wrote their names in bold strokes, Layla, Zuri. When he set the pen down, he knew the line of his life had changed forever. By morning, the storm had shifted from anger to a steady gray insistence, a crust of ice glazing the sidewalks and bowing the young trees along the avenue. Inside the tower, the air felt almost over-warm, as though the building's lungs were trying too hard. Patricia Alvarez returned just after sunrise with a messenger's urgency and a nurse's kindness, a stack of forms in her bag, and a thermos that steamed when she opened it. She greeted the sisters first, eye-level and unhurried, asking small questions to locate their morning. Whether they had slept, whether the rabbit still needed a blanket, whether toast sounded better than eggs. Only when their shoulders unclenched did she turn to Adrian with the paperwork that would determine what the next hour, the next week, the next 60 days might look like. He had signed thousands of documents in his life, but the petition for emergency guardianship did not read like anything he knew. It wasn't a deal sheet or a financing term sheet. It was a series of answers to questions that lived under the veneer of efficiency. Could he provide shelter? Could he provide food, medical care, schooling, emotional stability? Was he prepared to make decisions on behalf of the children's welfare? The lines were clinical, but the subtext was not. He read each paragraph twice, once with a developer's precision and once with a father's fear, the kind that doesn't announce itself but rises like tide against the rib. Patricia narrated as he worked so the process would not feel like a riddle. She explained that emergency guardianship was meant to protect children at the edge of crisis when no ready relative could. He found that the court preferred continuity and safety, that siblings were kept together whenever the system allowed it. She also explained the cautions, background checks, a home study, a scheduled evaluation, a review hearing at 60 days where progress would be measured by more than sentiment. When she finished, she capped her pen and said that social workers learned early to measure not promises but follow-through. At 9:30, the doors opened for Serena Vaughn, and the temperature in the room seemed to recalibrate to her pace. She didn't waste words. She skimmed the petition, asked Patricia 2 or 3 technical questions, and turned to Adrian with a look that tried to compress a plan into a glance. He handed her the folder and the list he had made while the girls. 8, pediatrician, school liaison, temporary guardianship letters. For emergencies, a counseling referral for grief support, a chauffeur schedule that would not feel like surveillance. Serena read it quickly and pressed her lips together, a lawyer's version of approval. We'll need affidavits confirming the mother's employment in the building, Serena said evenly. A statement from Miss Alvarez about the initial contact, proof of residency, criminal background clearance, and a plan for schooling over the next 2 weeks. The judge will want to know what a day in their life will look like starting tonight. Adrian nodded once. He had been building plans for years. He just hadn't built this one. I'll give the court a schedule, he said. Not because they require it, but because the girls deserve it. By noon, the courthouse called with a time. Emergencies made the docket elastic, and the name Cole had a way of bending schedules whether people liked it or not. Adrian rode down with Layla and Zuri in the service elevator to avoid the cameras that had already begun to linger on the main steps. In the car, he watched the city through their eyes. The bridges crusted white, the river a ribbon of dull pewter, the line of people outside a shelter shuffling into order under the careful choreography of one volunteer's voice. Zuri leaned her head against the window and tried to trace the condensation her breath left behind. Layla sat upright, a soldier's posture in a child's chair, the rabbit tucked with its face toward the light. Family Court lived in a building that had the solidity of an old promise and the fluorescent hum of an overworked secret. The corridors smelled faintly of floor polish and wool coats. There were parents with folders pressed to their chests, grandparents gripping handbags as though they could anchor the day. With leather and zipper, social workers who moved in quick diagonals to shave seconds off the distance between rooms. Patricia found them a quiet bench by a mural of scales and wheat and a child reaching for a star. They put it up to make the place feel like hope, she said to no one in particular. Some days the paint has to work hard. Serena briefed Adrian in a low voice while the girls colored in a photocopied handout someone had given them at check-in. She explained the judge's temperament, what good cause usually meant in cases like this, how the lack of ready relatives could cut 2 directions, toward the stability he offered or toward the fallback of foster placement where oversight was formalized. Do not oversell, she warned. Tell the truth as plainly as you can. Admit what you do not know yet. Articulate what you've already done in 24 hours and what you will do in 48. When their case was called, the courtroom was both smaller and larger than Adrian expected, small in its dimensions, large in the gravity it imposed. Judge Margaret Ellis, a woman with steel gray hair and a face that had practiced both patience and impatience to expert levels, looked over her glasses with the familiarity of someone who had seen most human arrangements and the many ways they came apart. A clerk read the caption. Patricia took the witness table with a stack of notes. Serena's legal pad remained blank, except for the word continuity written twice where Adrian could see it. Patricia told the story plainly. She described the initial contact, the girls' report of their mother's death, the check with the police ensuring that a welfare call had been made to the residence. She confirmed the absence of immediate relatives willing or able to assume care and named the risks, winter weather, an empty home, the fragility that follows shock. She explained Adrian's role, the space he offered, the food, the warmth, the immediate decision to petition rather than circumvent the system. She did not praise, she recorded. Judge Ellis listened. She asked procedural questions that mapped the day like a surveyor. She asked Layla one question only, whether she understood where she was and whether she felt safe with the man beside her. Layla did not glance for permission. She said she did, her voice steady in a way that sounded older than 9. The judge nodded once, not warmly, but with the respect paid to truth, spoken without embellishment. Then she looked to Adrian, and the room's power shifted in a way that felt both theatrical and deserved. Mr. Cole, Judge Ellis said, your generosity is noted. This court is also aware that generosity can be temporary. Explain to me in concrete terms why emergency guardianship placed with you provides the best odds for safety and stability over the next 60 days. He had planned a dozen versions of this answer in the car. None of them survived the reality of the bench. He told the judge that the girls knew where his building was because their mother had worked in it, that the women who cleaned his floors and emptied his conference rooms were part of the invisible infrastructure that had made his life possible, and that a smile he did not remember had made him legible to a woman he never knew by name. He said that last night he watched a 5-year-old fall asleep holding a rabbit like a passport and a 9-year-old remain alert long after she needed to be because alertness had kept them alive. He said the line between charity and responsibility was thinner then. People admitted, and that he was done pretending he couldn't see it. He did not speak of Owen immediately because the room was not a confessional and grief is not a credential. But when the judge asked what prepared him for the strain of parenting through loss, he said his son's name out loud and waited for the echo to fade. He described in a few sentences the tight kind that keep a life from toppling, the day the lake went silent, how he had tried to fill the silence with glass and steel, and how the silence had outlasted the buildings. He did not promise redemption, he asked for an assignment. 60 days, Judge Ellis said, as if testing the weight of the number. Here are the conditions: a home study within 2 weeks, background clearance for you and any adult with routine access to the children, proof of school enrollment or an interim plan, pediatric care established, and a grief counseling referral scheduled, weekly check-ins with Ms. Alvarez's office. You will not photograph them for press. You will not move them from the jurisdiction without court approval. At day 60, you will show me not what you intended to do, but what you did. The gavel struck once, a precise sound without drama. Serena breathed, a soft exhale that sounded like a shelf settling. Patricia glanced at Layla as if to say the law had chosen a bridge over a cliff today. Adrian felt the bizarre urge to bow. Instead, he nodded once and said, clearly enough, for the clerk to hear that he understood each condition and would meet it. Outside the building, the cameras had multiplied. A rumor in a city like Chicago grows legs and buys a coat by lunchtime. Serena directed Adrian through a side corridor and out a service exit where the wind took their faces in both hands and reminded them what Winter thought of victory laps. In the car, Serena handed him a checklist she had scribbled during the ruling. Do the first 5 today, she said. Schedule the rest before midnight. Publicly, say nothing. Privately, do everything. Back at the tower, the staff was kind in the careful way of people who know they've crossed into their employer's private war. The head housekeeper had already arranged 2 adjoining rooms on the quiet side of the penthouse, far from the clatter of the mechanicals. She had brought in lighter curtains to soften the glass, stacked quilts in a pewter trunk, and traded museum-grade throws for blankets that could be washed without ritual. She set out a basket of small shampoos and a row of miniature toothbrushes, as though she had once worked in a hotel and remembered that hospitality can be practiced at scale but felt most in miniature. Adrian watched the operations hum around him and realized how easily a life could fail if you tried to live it alone. He asked the building's security chief to restrict visitor access without names from Patricia's list. He phoned the private school he funded on the west side and asked for a meeting with the principal. Not to pull strings, but to understand what enrollment on a rolling basis would require. He called a pediatric practice recommended by a board member who never recommended lightly and got an appointment for the following afternoon. He texted Patricia a photo of the schedule Serena had drafted. Wake up, breakfast, a midday visit to the school, a stop at the clinic, dinner at 6, lights out by 8:30 with the hall light left on, so that the plan was documented before grief could rearrange it. There were small moments no checklist could contain. Suri discovered the warmth that lives in the seam where a sofa meets a sleeping child, and decided that was the place she belonged while cartoons murmured on low volume. Layla examined the books on the shelves, architecture monographs, river histories, a battered paperback about the city's alleys, and chose the one about bridges as if to make a thesis. She sat at the kitchen island with a pencil and drew lines between pylons while the chef, who had never cooked for a 5-year-old before, learned that grilled cheese has a perfect browning point beyond which a revolution is staged. When dusk folded itself against the windows and the city began to light its squares and lines, the penthouse felt less like a gallery and more like a house that had remembered how to be one. Still, night brings its own terms. The silence after 8 felt large enough to misplace a person in. Adrian walked the corridor he had walked 1,000 times and felt it become a different corridor simply because there were 2 small people asleep at the end of it. He stood in the doorway of their room and did the inventory every parent learns. The rise and fall of breath, the rabbit's ear caught in a small hand, the notebook he had bought for Layla placed not on a nightstand, but under a pillow, insurance against whatever dreams came hunting. In his study, he opened a drawer he had not opened in years and took out a photo that belonged to a life he had stopped examining. Owen smiled in a Little League uniform, the brim crooked because he had insisted on fixing it himself. Adrian set the photo on the desk beside a legal pad where the day's list had started, and wrote new lines under the old ones. Hall light left on, no closed. Doors. Ask Layla which objects must never be moved. Teach Zuri where the step stool lives. No meetings before school, read aloud, even if badly. He did not call them rules, he called them scaffolding. Around midnight, he stepped onto the balcony, because the city asks to be witnessed at least once a day from the outside. Wind knifed across the glass, and the jasmine he had fussed over last summer huddled in its planter like something that would forgive him another failure. He thought of the judge's conditions like plumb lines, true because they were simple. He thought of Patricia's face, the way fatigue and hope shared square footage there. He thought of Serena's steady hand, and the fact that she had written continuity twice. Because sometimes a single word must be used like a hammer until a door finally opened. When he came back in, he turned off every lamp except the hall light and the one over the kitchen sink, the night beacons of every safe house he had ever known. He paused once more at the girl's doorway and listened until the quiet reassured him. On his way to his own room, he passed a mirror and did not avert his eyes. He looked at the man reflected there, tie loosened, sleeves rolled, hair not as immaculate as the papers preferred, and thought, without ceremony, that day one had not beaten him. On the desk he left the photo of Owen and the list side by side, an old promise and a new plan occupying the same small square of wood. He did not draw a line between them. He let both sit, the way you let two truths share a table if you are going to survive your own story. Then he lay down, not to sleep so much as to keep watch, and somewhere between 1 hour and the next, the city's hum braided into the apartment's quiet, and the apartment's quiet became a kind of vow. Morning settled into the penthouse like a new tenant, cautious at first, then quietly territorial. The house, once curated for solitude, began to adopt a human schedule. Coffee still burbled before sunrise, but now it shared the counter with child-sized bowls, and a small parade of vitamin gummies that looked like candy and required adult vigilance. In the kitchen, the chef learned the 3-tier code of grilled cheese golden. Not blonde, crisp, not hard, triangles, not rectangles, while Zuri, already wearing the title she had given herself, enforced the kitchen boss charter. Extra napkins, no black edges, marshmallows only after real food. Layla did not police or hover. She watched and annotated in silence, as if she were writing a manual for a life she intended to audit later. Adrian set the pace because children, he quickly remembered, trust clocks when people are new. Breakfast at 8, shoes by the door at 8:30, jackets zipped by the elevator at 8:30. 5. A margin built in for lost mittens and last-minute questions that were rarely about clothing. The hallway light remained on until they were back from the day. A small lighthouse in a narrow sea. Each morning before they left, Adrian checked the list Serena had written during the ruling. Pediatrician, school, counseling, home study, and moved a line from schedule to done. It was the sort of progress report he had once demanded from project managers. Now it felt like mortar holding disparate bricks together. The pediatrician's office occupied a brick building on a quiet street, its waiting room decorated with a universe of laminated animals and a wooden bead maze that had entertained generations without ever announcing why. The nurse conducted the intake with a gentleness that did not draw attention to itself. She measured height and weight, reviewed vaccines, asked about sleep and appetite. When the doctor joined them, she spoke partly to Adrian, and partly to an invisible ledger of experience. She explained how grief manifests as stomachaches, withdrawal, bursts of energy at odd hours. She emphasized routine, hydration, fresh air, the kind of ordinary stability that cannot be bottled. Adrian took notes without pretending improvisation would carry him. When Zuri chose a sticker from the basket at the end, she picked a silver star and placed it on the rabbit's remaining ear. Layla put hers on the inside cover of her new journal, as if certifying it for use. The school conversation required a different map. Adrian sat with the principal of the West Side Academy his foundation had funded, a woman who had shepherded hundreds of children across the precarious years between first readers and algebra. She explained transfer processes and supplemental support, how children join mid-year, and how classrooms make room. She asked about morning commute times, aftercare, and whether the girls preferred quiet nooks or bustling tables for reading. Adrian admitted he didn't know yet and asked how he could learn. The principal smiled in the way of people who prefer questions to declarations. She assigned a liaison to shadow Layla and Zuri on their first week, not to watch for failure but to notice what helped. Before they left, she handed Adrian a packet labeled not in bureaucratic code, but in human language. First week, what to expect and how to breathe. Back at the tower, the staff recalibrated without the fuss rich homes sometimes make when confronted with real life. The housekeeper reorganized a linen closet to include spare gloves, a basket of tiny socks that seemed to multiply, and a labeled shelf for art supplies. Maintenance installed a step stool in the bathroom, then added felt pads to its feet, so it wouldn't scrape tile and startle a child awake at midnight. Security rewrote visitor protocols with Patricia's list at the center because safety, in a city that pretends it can out-argue risk, is an agreement you renew every hour. The doorman began to keep a book of smile-worthy details for the girls, names of the morning dogs, the time the midday sun struck the creak of glass across the street, which elevator was fastest, and why it sometimes wasn't. Adrian's calendar shifted in ways publicists hate and children love. He moved board calls to late mornings after school drop-off, declined 2 panels that would have involved applause, but not meaning, and asked his assistant to group meetings into tight blocks so afternoons remained elastic. He stopped by the office briefly on the 3rd day and noticed the way conversations lowered when he passed, not out of disrespect but because grown men with immaculate haircuts seldom arrive with glitter on their cuffs. His CFO asked if everything was all right. Adrian said it was and meant it. The public relations team suggested a gracious statement to control the narrative. He told them there would be no narrative to control. An internal memo sufficed. Mr. Cole is unavailable until 10 most mornings. Emergencies remain emergencies. Otherwise, build the building. Patricia checked in twice in the first week, unobtrusive but present. She toured the penthouse with a social worker's 2-eyed gaze. One eye for what is, one eye for what could go wrong. She noted smoke detectors and outlet covers, counted the number of locked cabinets where cleaning agents lived, checked that bedroom doors opened easily and never fully closed. She asked about bedtime and nightmares, about favorite foods and feared sounds. She explained that kids in grief sometimes test tenderness because loss has taught them its unreliability. She reminded Adrian that consistency is not a mood, it is a policy. He wrote policy of comfort in his notebook and underlined it, amused and sobered by his own turn of phrase. The first Saturday bore evidence that ordinary could be its own miracle. Pancakes became a tradition despite the chef's pained confession that batter offended his precision. The kitchen filled with the small chaos of batter drips and fork rhythms, Zuri's commentary drifting like confetti as she installed a plush stool that gave her jurisdiction over topping distribution. Layla rarely interrupted, but she listened as if cataloging these domestic cadences for a report only she would read. After breakfast, they walked to Millennium Park and watched skaters circle the ribbon like measured joy. Wind burned cheeks pink and sent the rabbit's ear into a permanent lean. On the way back, Zuri fell asleep sitting upright in the car, head tipped toward the seatbelt. Adrian waited in the driveway for 3 full minutes, unwilling to carry her in and risk breaking whatever small magic had finally allowed her surrender. In quieter hours, learning seeped into corners. Adrian began to teach them the city not as a map of attractions, but as a living system, how a river gets reversed, how bridges rise and fall, how neighborhoods change and how they are defended. He showed them blueprints the way other parents showed recipes, tracing lines to reveal intent. He taught Layla the difference between load-bearing and decorative walls then, asked her which promises in life felt structural and which felt cosmetic. She didn't answer immediately, but the question lodged, and he saw her measuring days with a builder's eye. Zuri, not yet burdened by metaphor, started drawing boxes with windows and fat chimneys that smoked heart-shaped puffs, then shifted to triangles on stick stilts after he explained how floodplains worked. The rabbit attended all seminars, occasionally serving as a scale model for rescue scenarios. There was laughter, and if it sounded tentative at first, it grew muscle with use. A housekeeping cart stuck in a doorway became slapstick theater, a sock lost, and the dryer reappeared on the rabbit's ear as a statement headpiece. A piano in the corner, long treated as sculpture, proved itself capable of producing something like music when small hands pressed caution into melody. Yet the best evidence that the house was becoming a home arrived in silence. Fewer checks of the lock after lights out, fewer seconds between the click of a lamp, and the sigh that comes when darkness does not feel predatory. A notebook that moved from under a pillow to atop a nightstand, as though trust needed less hiding. Outside, curiosity thickened into chatter. 2 tabloid sites wrote speculative pieces with photos of the tower at dusk, the color of the sky doing most of the heavy lifting. A business columnist wondered aloud whether philanthropy was about to become a lifestyle brand. A late-night host made a decent joke about marshmallows and mergers. Adrian ignored all of it. The only audience that mattered climbed onto stools in his kitchen and asked whether stars were colder than snow. The home study scheduled for week 2 came with a packet of expectations that read like a gentle inspection of the soul daily. Rhythms, discipline philosophy, communication plan with the school, emergency contacts support network, medical follow-ups. Adrian submitted records without drama and asked the evaluator, politely, without spin, what families did well when the stakes were this high. The answer was not a trick. Families that narrate their days out loud. So children learn to expect tomorrow. Families that keep promises, small and keep them. Families that allow children to help in ways that matter, so competence can begin to compete with fear. He made a note to ask Layla to choose the week's dinners and to assign Zuri custody of the hall light at bedtime, with the power to decide when safety gave way to darkness. Serena kept a steady hand on the legal rail. She filed updates, scheduled background checks for every adult with a badge in Adrian's private world, and built a timeline of facts that would withstand more scrutiny than sentiment. In a brief call, she reminded him the 60-day hearing would behave like a demanding project review. Don't make it inspiring, she said. Make it accountable. He said he understood and meant it. His empire had always rewarded metrics. Now his life with the girls would too. Grief did not disappear because the calendar filled with errands. It altered its tactics. Zuri woke once in the middle of the night and stood in the doorway like an apparition. Rabbit held by one leg, saying nothing until Adrian, awake already, lifted a hand and said softly, "I see you," which seemed to be all she needed to cross the threshold and claim the spare pillow he had not pretended was for anyone else. Layla began to ask questions at odd angles, as if by approaching the truth indirectly she could keep it from breaking. "Do buildings forget what used to be there?" she asked one afternoon, staring at a photo of a tower that had replaced a row of brick two-flats. Adrian answered carefully that buildings remember in the ways people allow them to. Plaques. Stories, the shape of a street that refuses to turn even when it would be convenient. She nodded and wrote for 10 minutes without looking up. On the 10th day, during a grocery run, Adrian insisted on doing personally, because the girls deserved to see their names on a bag of apples. Chosen for them, the doorman spoke with the delicate urgency of someone choosing not to alarm a householder in front of children. A man had stopped by twice asking questions, he said in a low voice, eyes flicking briefly toward the elevator where Zuri was counting floor numbers. The man's description was unspecific enough to fit a dozen faces. His tone had been almost friendly. He had used the phrase "the Carter girls" as if testing it for resonance. The doorman had told him nothing and alerted security. Adrian thanked him without changing expression and decided the matter would not follow them upstairs. Yet later, alone in the study while the girls read on the carpet with their feet touching at the ankles in the unconscious choreography of siblings, he wrote a new line on Serena's checklist and another on Patricia's unknown. Mail inquiring at door, log description, pull cameras, inform CPS. He saw no reason to deliver worry to children without evidence, but he also saw no reason to allow chance to audition. He had lived long enough to know shadows always arrive first as rumor. In the margins of this emerging life, Adrian's work did not recede, it recalibrated. He liked the feel of that word more than retreat, which sounded like loss. Construction sites still needed decisions, unions still needed schedules, investors still needed reasons to believe that delays were strategy and not drift. But each afternoon, he found himself measuring success against a different ledger, the piano sound growing less tentative, the hall light clicked. Off by smaller fingers, a drawing on the refrigerator of a house on stilts with a star above it, labeled in careful print safe place. He pinned it with the same seriousness he once reserved for architectural renderings and felt, for a quiet minute, that he had reached a part of the skyline no steel could touch. The city thawed and froze and thawed again. Snow went granular, then slick, then vanished from the streets in a trick older than asphalt. On the 15th evening after homework and a failed attempt at teaching the difference between cumin and cinnamon that ended in laughter and a necessary rescue by the chef, the three of them stood at the window and counted lights on the river. Zuri assigned each light a wish. Layla recorded the count and the time in her journal, not because data would save her, but because it let tomorrow learn today's language. Adrian listened to their voices stacking in the air like scaffolding and understood that structure is not always wood or steel. Sometimes it is the echo of people who keep showing up. When the girls finally drifted to sleep and the apartment returned to the soft hush a good house makes, He walked the familiar path past the hall light, paused as always, and looked in. The rabbit lay on its side like a veteran. Layla's journal rested open, face down, the spine unbroken despite determined use. The house exhaled. He returned to the study where the photo of Owen shared desk space with a calendar that had grown crowded with appointments of the heart. He did not flinch from the pairing anymore. Two lives could inhabit one life if you built carefully. He rechecked the security alert, typed the word follow-up beside the log entry, and closed the laptop. The wind pressed briefly against the glass and then let go, as if the building had passed a test administered by the invisible. On the refrigerator, the House on Stilts drawing waited to be joined by the next draft. On the nightstand, the packet from the school sat beneath the How to Breathe guide. No longer a novelty, but a tool. Tomorrow would bring another run of small tasks that, knit together, formed a net. He had decided to call that net by its proper name, a family. Security footage settled the question that had been gnawing at the edges of the new routine. The unknown male who had asked at the desk for the Carter girls reappeared across 3 angles: street, vestibule, side door, wearing a scuffed brown jacket and the kind of smile that asked for favors it had not earned. Patricia compared the stills to an old intake note in the file and did not hesitate. The man was Carl Whitaker, Denise Carter's former partner, the one who drifted in and out of their lives, leaving debt and small disasters as his signature. His record showed 2 fraud charges and a suspended license, nothing that would headline a news scroll, everything that suggested volatility. She logged the encounter, notified the courthouse liaison, and told Adrian to expect escalation. Preparation took the shape of simple, relentless steps. Serena drafted a no trespass notice for the building and filed an emergency motion for temporary protective conditions pending a full hearing. School pickup protocols were rewritten to require a code phrase and a photo ID that lived in the principal's desk, not on a phone. The doorman received a 1-page sheet with Carl's photo and a single instruction at the top: do not engage, call upstairs, document. Adrian walked the girls through their own version of a safety plan without dramatics. Where to stand if a stranger pressed the buzzer, which employee names were always safe. Why adults, not children, answered doors. When Zuri asked if something bad was happening, Adrian chose plain words over reassurance that would peel under stress. He told her that sometimes people who lost their place in a story tried to force themselves back in, and that his job was to keep the pages from tearing. Carl arrived 2 afternoons later, as if summoned by the new scaffolding. He chose the private corridor to the penthouse and knocked with a cadence meant to sound like familiarity. Adrian opened only as far as the safety chain allowed. Up close, Carl smelled of cold air and old cigarettes, the kind of fatigue that comes from sleeping in cars and telling lies that require constant tending. He tried charm first, the exaggerated grin, the performative shrug, the line about coming man to man. Adrian did not reward it. He stated the boundary, named the protective filing, and said the girls were not available for unapproved contact. Carl's face tightened. He tried menace next, the quiet kind that traffics in insinuation and hints that courts hate mess. Adrian ended the tableau by signaling security with a gesture that belonged to 100 boardrooms and a single necessary threshold. The door closed, the lock seated. The incident joined the record. Predictably, paper followed posture. Carl filed a petition seeking recognition of paternity and immediate visitation with Zuri. The motion was thin on facts and thick with entitlement, but it carried enough procedural weight to require a hearing. Serena answered with a tight, factual opposition: no prior support, no caretaking history, documented instability, security logs, Patricia's assessments, school and medical records establishing continuity in Adrian's care. She did not call Carl abusive. She called him absent and unreliable and let the filings perform the rest. The court set a date. Patricia arranged for a child advocate to meet with Layla privately, not to rehearse testimony, but to teach her what a courtroom sounds like so surprise would not do extra harm. The days before the hearing looked ordinary to anyone outside the apartment. Pancakes happened on schedule. The piano kept learning the same song and then a harder one. A dentist appointment went better than expected because the hygienist had a gift for making fluoride taste like a game. Inside, however, the air felt calibrated to alertness again. Layla slept but lighter, her journal migrating back under the pillow. Zuri walked a beat closer to Adrian in public spaces without seeming to know she had moved. Adrian practiced stillness so they could borrow it. At night, when the apartment exhaled, he reviewed Serena's exhibits until the edges of paper blurred and the arguments reduced to a single imperative: prove stability, protect the girls. Family court did not change to accommodate this particular story. The same fluorescent hum, the same scuffed benches, the same ritual of names and case numbers. Spoke of a system that never sleeps because harm prefers the hours when most people do. Judge Margaret Ellis took the bench with the tired grace of a professional listener and called the matter. Carl appeared in a clean jacket that fit like he had borrowed it, his hair too carefully combed, the performance of responsibility getting its first and only outing. He had chosen to represent himself. The choice made the morning both easier and more dangerous. Patricia went first, methodical as always. She described the initial crisis, the immediate placement with Adrian under court order, the observable stability in the weeks since attendance at school, pediatric evaluations, counseling referrals, routines that looked like life, not theater. She narrated the security incidents without adjectives. She repeated the rule that governs every decision in that room, best interest of the child. Serena followed with the scaffolding, photos stamped with dates, logs with times, a timeline that made continuity visible. She asked for denial of visitation pending adjudication of paternity and a continued bar on unapproved contact. She did not sound fierce, she sounded inevitable. Judge Ellis turned to Carl and gave him the floor. He spoke like a man who had expected the strength of his desire to count as evidence. He said he loved the girl and wanted to be part of her life. He said money had been hard and that people misjudged circumstances they didn't live. He implied Adrian was buying a family as if generosity were a vice when practiced by the rich. He framed absence as a misunderstanding. The courtroom heard what he had not said. No dates, no diapers, no first days of school, no pediatric forms signed in waiting rooms that smell like stickers and bleach. The judge asked the only question that mattered for the moment, "Where have you been?" Carl answered with a fog of explanations that asked the court to make sympathetic shapes from vapor. Judge Ellis did not. She could not order the past to rewrite itself into a fatherhood that had not happened. She could, however, order the present to remain intact while the truth of biology, if it mattered, was determined. On Serena's motion, the court denied immediate visitation and kept the protective conditions in place. On Patricia's recommendation, any future contact would require a supervised setting and only after two prerequisites: A, verified paternity test, and a credible plan for non-disruptive involvement that did not threaten the girl's stability. The judge spoke to Layla from the bench with unusual care. She thanked her for courage without asking it to work overtime, and told her that adults bore the burden of procedure. Layla nodded once, a small acknowledgement that reached the back row. Zuri, who had waited with the advocate in a side room surrounded by coloring pages and kind voices, did not enter the courtroom at all. When the gavel came down, the room loosened a few notches. Serena packed the files with the quiet satisfaction of someone who knows a battle is only won by inches. Patricia touched Adrian's sleeve in the hallway, a permission to exhale that did not require words. Carl left without looking back, which is how men who rely on bluster often leave when bluster fails. The hallway swallowed him the way bureaucratic buildings do. It would spit him out again soon enough, but not with the leverage he had hoped to claim. Back at the tower, the day continued because days have an arrogance that helps children heal. Zuri's after-school report included a new best friend and a classroom rabbit that wanted to eat her sleeve. Layla turned the courtroom into 2 paragraphs in her journal, spare, accurate, undramatic. Then asked Adrian if buildings ever learned to trust their foundations. He answered that good ones are inspected regularly and repaired before cracks become stories. She seemed to like the answer enough to put the notebook back on the nightstand instead of under the pillow. Serena called after dinner with the next steps. The paternity test, if Carl pursued it, would take weeks. In the meantime, their job was to live in a way that made the review hearing feel like a formality. She warned that men like Carl sometimes pivot from legal to opportunistic tactics, friend of a friend messages, drop-ins at places they are not supposed to know, pressure applied where policy is softer than locks. Security protocols would stay tight. Patricia would increase contact briefly, not because of doubt but because oversight, correctly practiced, is a kind of shelter. That night, the hall light burned the same modest cone it had burned every night since the decision. Adrian stood in the doorway and watched both sisters breathe, the rabbit lying between them like an old soldier. The city beyond the glass kept its own pulse. On his desk, the photo of Owen did not accuse or console, it simply existed alongside a calendar crowded with obligations that mattered. He added a line to the list he kept beneath it: "Do not let the fight define the home." Then he turned out the lamp in the study and left the hall light on. Because some promises are made not with words but with wattage and repetition, and because some chapters are won not by speeches but by the quiet refusal to let disruption write the ending. The quiet after the hearing lasted exactly long enough for the apartment to learn a new pattern of calm. 2 school days passed without incident. The building's log showed only deliveries. And familiar faces, the doorman's notebook of small charms expanded to include a golden retriever with a pink bandana and the precise minute. The sun flashed off a nearby facade like a lighthouse signal. Adrian let routine do its work. He walked the girls to the elevator in the morning, returned for meetings that now obeyed a narrower window, and learned how to convert late afternoon restlessness into a walk around the block that ended, almost by accident, at a bakery where the staff had already begun to draw rabbits on to-go bags. The house remembered how to hold laughter without flinching. The knock came at the service entrance because real turning points are courteous enough not to announce themselves to the whole world. It was late. The city's daytime machinery dimmed to its evening thrum, the girls reading in their beds with lights low. Adrian opened with his shoulders set and his mind already measuring risk, then paused. The woman in the hallway did not look like trouble. She looked like exhaustion that had learned how to walk, coat too thin for the temperature, eyes ringed the way eyes get when sleep is a rumor, hands gripping a manila folder as if it were proof of something that needed proof. She introduced herself as Kendra Williams, her voice carrying the kind of careful honesty that does not try to sell itself. She said she had been a friend to Denise Carter, not a best friend and not a constant one, but the kind of friend poverty allows, present when she could be, absent when rent and deadlines and bad luck demanded too much. She said she had stayed away from the girls because Denise asked her to. Fire attracts attention, and attention attracts systems that take longer to forgive. Then she said she had found something, and that if it mattered for the girl's safety, the person who needed to see it was the man currently keeping the lights on and the door locked. Adrian let her in because instinct and training both tell you that some burdens become evidence when they cross a threshold. He sat her at the kitchen island. He poured tea without asking because a body holding itself together that tightly will not ask. He waited. Kendra slid the folder across the stone with both palms, as if weight distributed equally would keep any guilt from spilling. Inside, the documents were unremarkable in form and devastating in effect. Letters written. In Denise's hand, the looped script of someone who had learned to be neat for other people's benefit, alongside hospital intake summaries, clinic bills, a copy of a birth certificate with the father's line blank, and a small photograph whose edges had tired from being handled. On the back of the photograph, Denise had written a sentence that lived like a hinge between two lives, not his. I couldn't tell her then. The shape of the truth presented itself without theatrics. Zuri was not Carl Whitaker's child. Denise had left the father's name empty, not as laziness, but as a defense. In a world where some men treat blood as leverage and the law sometimes abets the performance, an empty line can be a strategy. Kendra had kept the folder in a drawer because people in the crosshairs of hard luck learned to store their receipts. When Carl resurfaced with swagger and insinuation, she decided the receipts belonged somewhere they could do more than gather dust. Adrian read every page twice. He asked Kendra soft questions designed to confirm what the documents suggested, rather than invite speculation. She answered with dates and places and context. She did not invent conversations or assign motives. When she had said what she knew, she said what she didn't, and that restraint lent the truth a cleanliness many courtrooms never see. He thanked her, tried to hand back the tea money could never repay, and walked her to the service door with a building's worth of gratitude. He did not turn into speeches. Before she left, she said one more thing in the flat tone of someone who has learned to make predictive statements. Carl will not go quietly. Adrian nodded and promised a counterpoint. Neither would they. Serena answered on the first ring because she understood the hour at which good news avoids the phone. Adrian summarized, sparing adjectives. Serena's questions were predictable and necessary. Are the documents originals or copies? Does the handwriting match any known sample? Do the hospital records align with the child's birth date? Does the chain of custody between Denise and Kendra and you withstand skepticism? She asked for scans now and originals by morning. She did not speak of triumph. She spoke of filings. By midnight, she had drafted a supplemental response to Carl's petition, moving the argument from absence to impossibility. Without paternity, the legal plank Carl stood on dissolved into water. Patricia read the same scans just after dawn, her email reply arriving with the speed of someone who sleeps with a charger on the nightstand. She updated the case file, flagged the court liaison, and adjusted her schedule to be in the building later that day. She reminded Adrian that while the legal picture had clarified, the emotional one required a slower geometry. Children understand belonging in the body first and in the paperwork second. Telling Zuri would be a matter of timing and framing, not just fact. He told Layla that afternoon because older siblings carry the architecture of a family's truth and deserve not to be surprised by it. He did not stage the conversation as a reveal. He placed the folder on the table with the respect one gives to a map and traced the lines Denise had traced herself. Layla read silently, the way she read most things, her finger resting on the sentence on the back of the photograph. She did not cry. She did not go sharp. She asked one question in a voice that had learned how to be even, whether this meant Zuri belonged any less to her. When Adrian said no, not in law, not in heart, not in any ledger that mattered, Layla let out a breath she had been holding for longer than she knew. Then she made a small practical decision that carried more wisdom than any adult plan. She took a fresh notebook from the drawer and wrote Zuri's journal on the first page, because some truths are absorbed best when a child writes her own version of them. They did not tell Zuri that night. 5-year-olds do not need midnight to be crowded. They kept the bedtime ritual intact: teeth, story, hall light, rabbit's ear tucked, and let sleep do its ancient work. After the lights were out, Adrian sat in the study with the folder open, the photo of Owen angled on the desk like a companion rather than a relic. He did not seek messages in the pairing. He allowed fact and memory to share space. There had been a boy whose name he could say now without splintering, and a girl whose birth certificate contained a defensive silence. Both realities asked the same thing: do the next right thing, and then the next. The next day proved how quickly paper can become protection when logic joins it. Serena filed the supplemental response and attached sworn statements from Kendra and Patricia. The court clerk set a brief conference to consider the new material. Serena advised that the goal was not drama but dismissal, the quiet kind that leaves a would-be plaintiff with nowhere to place his voice. That afternoon, Judge Ellis reviewed the filing in chambers and issued an order. That felt like a relief, not because it was loud, but because it was precise. No visitation, paternity prerequisite, protective conditions continued. Any further attempt to contact the children to be considered interference. The order did not yet make anything permanent, but it turned Carl's momentum into paperwork with no doors. The apartment felt different, and not just because the legal weather had improved. Relief has a way of resetting how air moves through a house. The girls came home from school with ordinary reports. Library day was a success. Someone's lunchbox smelled like pickles. The class rabbit had learned to tolerate having its name pronounced with a whisper. Zuri drew a picture of a star resting above a tall house on thin legs and labeled it safe in letters that leaned forward, and Layla wrote 3 sentences in Zuri's journal about pancakes and bus routes and the art of placing markers back in their caps. None of this resolved anything permanently, and yet it did. Families are built in increments that look like trivia to outsiders and like architecture to the people living inside. Adrian took them to the community center in Pilsen the following weekend because doing good far from home felt too much like publicity, and doing good near home felt like good practice. The foundation had funded a school garden, and the lumber for raised beds had arrived with the enthusiasm of wet pine. Kids learned to measure twice before driving a screw. Grandmothers taught the quiet miracles of soil that holds and soil that drains. A teenager with a skateboard explained to Zuri that worms were not gross but collaborative. Layla painted a plank with careful strokes, choosing deep blue and naming it River when asked to explain, because sometimes a 9-year-old understands civic allegory better than adults who spend weekends on panels. A woman in a green cardigan brushed sawdust from her sleeve and told Adrian that this kind of project fed more than bodies. He agreed and did not offer a quote. Education threaded itself through smaller hours too. In the evenings he began to tell the city story the way other families tell lore. The time the river ran backward. Because engineers refused to surrender to typhoid, the fire that burned maps and money and still failed to kill. Chicago's appetite for itself, the lake that looks calm and isn't, the neighborhoods that rename themselves without asking permission, and the people who insist on the older names because love is also a kind of resistance. Layla collected these episodes as proof that places heal. Zuri turned them into drawings with chimneys that did not smoke hearts anymore but stars. 2 weeks after the folder arrived, the building's security log went quiet enough that it began to feel like paper had done its job. Carl did not return to the desk. If he filed anything else, Serena would learn about it before the ink dried. If he tried new angles, the protocols were set to flatten them. Stability, which had seemed like a luxury on the first day, began to feel like a practice. The hall light clicked off earlier because Zuri petitioned for courage and earned it in small rations. Layla's journal left the pillow fort for a nightstand regularly enough to suggest trust was winning. On the refrigerator, the house on stilts gained a small detail under the star. a rectangle with a doorman drawn as a simple smiling line labeled James in block letters because security is not just policy, it is also the person who remembers your favorite joke. The truth in the folder, clean, unavoidable, quietly explosive, changed the legal picture and the emotional one in ways that were not finished yet. Serena hinted that questions might surface about the blank line and whether a name belonged there at all. Patricia prepared a script for later, when Zuri would be old enough to hold a conversation that lasted longer than a picture. Adrian did not race that clock. He watched the girls memorize the route from the elevator to the kitchen with eyes half closed because confidence likes rehearsal. He learned which noise from the heating system meant nothing and which meant maintenance. He practiced a new version of leadership that did not demand applause and measure success in unremarkable Tuesdays. Toward the end of that steady month, the city softened under a thaw that felt sincere. Sidewalks reappeared at full width. Cab drivers rolled windows an inch for the first time. Dogs acted as if the year had never known snow. Adrian took the girls to the library because habit is a better sport than novelty, and because the children's room on a Saturday morning sounded like a country he wanted them to claim. Zuri found a book about dragons that hoarded not gold but lost buttons. Layla chose a biography of a woman who mapped stars. Before anyone would pay her to, Adrian picked up a book of city photographs that weren't glossy and liked them more for it. As they stood in line, Layla asked one of her slant questions, whether some truths were better as letters first. And he realized she had not stopped considering how to tell Zuri the story you can never tell only once. That night, after they were asleep and the hall light did its calibrated work, Adrian took the folder from the desk and tucked it into the fireproof box where passports and birth certificates live. He rested his hand on the lid longer than necessary, not to dramatize the gesture but to acknowledge that information can be both shield and anchor. On the desk, Owen's photograph watched without opinion. Adrian added a new line to the list beneath it, the one that had started as a schedule and had become a ledger of choices. Tell hard truths at a pace the heart can absorb, let paper protect, let love explain. He turned out the study lamp and crossed the corridor past a soft halo that had become the apartment's flag. The city outside adjusted its lights. Inside, the apartment kept its quiet promises. Tomorrow would come with its errands and emails, and a chance encounter that would test everything they had learned about truth and timing, but for now the house slept like a structure that trusted its foundation. The thaw held for a week, a tentative covenant between the city and the calendar. School mornings unfolded with competent repetition, toast trimmed the way Zuri preferred, the hall light extinguished by a ceremonious tap of her finger, Layla's journal migrating from nightstand to backpack, as if ideas needed commuting too. Evenings stitched themselves from small, sturdy pieces, piano practice that sounded a little braver, flashcards that rewarded attention more than speed, the soft negotiations of bedtime. Paperwork moved through Serena's office with the quiet velocity of a well-run canal, filings answered, orders logged, next dates set in ink. Patricia's check-ins grew shorter because consistency had begun to speak for itself. The encounter that reset the compass did not arrive as drama. It presented like administrative business at a lobby desk. Adrian came in from a short walk, wind mild against his coat, to find James, the doorman who now appeared in Zuri's drawings as a rectangle with a smile, standing slightly straighter than usual. Beside him waited a man in his late 30s, tailored but unadorned, posture of a person who had learned to stand still in difficult rooms. His face carried the unremarkable handsomeness of someone rarely photographed, and the careful eyes of someone who had watched granular details for a living. The man introduced himself as Dr. Elias Monroe, a trauma surgeon at a city hospital across town. He did not lead with credentials. He led with the sentence people use when facts have waited too long to be spoken. He said he had known Denise Carter briefly years ago, that he had left for a fellowship and returned to find the number he had used no longer. Answered that only recently, through a mutual acquaintance named Kendra. He had learned there might be a child he had not been told about. He said her name softly, as though testing whether it changed the shape of the air. Zuri. Adrian measured every word the way he now measured the temperature of the apartment at night. Claims are not truths, they are doors that require keys. He did not argue. He did not invite the man upstairs. He asked for identification because caution is not rudeness when guardianship is your job. The ID matched the name in hospital. The manner matched the kind of person who has had to submit to verification without sulking. Adrian set a simple boundary and made it verbal so the building would hear it too. Contact will go through counsel and CPS, he said. There will be no direct approach to the children. Dr. Monroe nodded. not as surrender, but as recognition of a rule he would have written himself if he were on the other side of the door. The surgeon did not ask for access. He asked to leave an envelope. He said it contained a letter written for a child, not a petition for a judge. He said its purpose was introduction, apology for absence, and permission. Permission for Zuri to ignore it now, to return to it later, or to throw it away if that is where safety lived. He said the envelope would not arrive with conditions attached. Adrian took it because some materials belong in the chain of custody that protects hearts as effectively as it protects evidence. He thanked James with a glance that said the building had done its work, and rode the elevator up with the envelope flat against his palm. Serena answered on the first ring because the hour was early enough that strategy could be proactive rather than reactive. Adrian relayed the encounter in the exacting prose she preferred. Time, location, identification, verified, no breach of building protocol, no approach to the children, one sealed envelope. Serena asked him to hold the letter unopened until she documented receipt. Then she surprised him by telling him to read it first, alone. "You're the filter," she said. "If it's manipulative, it never reaches her. If it's clean, you'll know how to present it without turning the moment into weather." Patricia's text came through minutes later because Serena had already looped her in. The caseworker's advice did not contradict the lawyer's. It translated it into family practice. She recommended that any reading happen in a space Zuri already associates with warmth, a kitchen, a corner of the couch at dusk, without ceremony or an audience. She underlined 2 rules: no secrets and no deadlines. Truth offered at a pace a child controls becomes a scaffold. Truth delivered like a verdict becomes a weight. Adrian sat at his desk, the envelope between his hands, and looked once at the photograph of Owen, the boy in a crooked-brimmed cap whose memory no longer arrived as a blade. He opened the letter with the quiet care he reserved for permits and condolence notes, documents that change what a day means. The handwriting inside was even, the paragraphs unadorned, the tone not saintly and not sloppy. Dr. Elias Monroe wrote that he had failed at timing, not at love, that he had chosen ambition that took him far away and had returned. To find distance had set like concrete, that he would not seek to undo. Any safety the child had found, that he hoped one day, if and only, if it felt right to her and the people protecting her, she might want to know the man whose biology she may carry and the gentler parts of his story, that he would not be offended by silence, that he understood. Even correct truths can harm if forced to arrive too soon. He closed by thanking the person reading with her, the guardian who had made room for a letter to exist without becoming a demand. There was no flavor of threat. There was no claim staked in law or in sentiment. It was, in the rarest way, a letter written for a child and not a courtroom. He did not rush. He cooked dinner as usual and let the house keep its rituals. After the dishes were rinsed and the piano released exactly 4 notes of what might be a song, he sat with Zuri at the kitchen island that had become their parliament. He used few words because 5-year-olds can drown in adult context. He told her a man had written to say he knew her mother once and missed the chance to be around when she was little. He told her the letter said she did not have to read it now or ever. He told her he could read it first and tell her whether it felt safe. She asked the single question every child asks when identity tries to change costumes. "Are you still my dad?" And he answered without qualifiers. "Yes," he said. And because attribution matters, he added, "Adrian said it." She nodded, satisfied not by logic but by the solidity of the voice that had gotten her through winter. She wanted to hear the letter. He read slowly, disrupting nothing, making space after each short paragraph, the way one pauses at stair landings with small legs. The words did not set off alarms. They did not try to outshine the life she was living. When he finished, Zuri did not ask follow-up questions. She traced the edge of the envelope with one finger and said she wanted to keep it in her box where the rabbit's extra ear ribbons lived. She added a condition that was both child and philosopher, only if Layla knows. He smiled because transparency had already begun to take root in her. He brought Layla into the kitchen. The older sister listened, eyes steady, posture loose enough to tell him the ground had not moved under her. She asked to copy the date into Zuri's journal, then did so in her precise hand, evidence that the family's timeline would remain legible to their future selves. Secrecy avoided, timing respected, boundaries intact. The apartment did not change temperature. It absorbed the new fact without flushing hot or cold. The next day, Adrian met Dr. Monroe for coffee in a public place with Serena's blessing and Patricia's awareness. He chose a bland chain cafe rather than a discreet club because some conversations should not be dressed. He set the terms plainly. No contact with Zuri absent court approval and therapeutic guidance, no appearances. At school or the building, no narrative offered to the press no matter how hungry its mouth. The surgeon agreed to each condition without lawyering the edges. He offered medical history in writing and promised more if testing made it relevant. He did not ask for tests now. He asked for patience. He did not claim rights. He asked for the chance to be a sentence in a story someone else was writing. Serena recommended a quiet layer of verification. Hospital HR confirmation of employment, a review of the timeline. Against Denise's letters, a discreet outreach to Kendra to confirm the human texture around the facts. None of it contradicted the letter. All of it argued for caution that did not curdle into suspicion. Patricia advised looping a child therapist into planning, not because meeting was imminent, but because structure makes future fears smaller. Adrian made the appointments and returned home in time to walk the route. From the elevator to the kitchen at the hour when the day changes hands. Routine insisted on itself and won. Zuri lost a tooth and declared the event of national significance. Layla memorized the bus line numbers on their block just to prove to herself that unpredictability could be mapped. The chef learned to burn cinnamon on purpose in a pan so the whole kitchen smelled like a holiday without requiring one. The piano traveled from 4 notes to 8. The hall light stayed on a little shorter because the hallway itself had started to look like a friend. The envelope's existence did not vanish. It became part of the house's quiet inventory, stored where important things live but not granted power to summon storms. On a Tuesday, Zuri asked if the man liked pancakes. Adrian said he did not. No, and that the answer mattered less than whether she wanted more syrup. On a Thursday, Layla asked if some truths were better as letters before. They were voices. Adrian said letters give time a shape you can hold. On a Saturday, while they waited in line at the library and the children's room performed its weekly miracle. Of joyful order, Zuri picked out a book about bodies that explained blood types without sounding like a test. She placed it in the stack without commentary. The librarian stamped the due date, as if to say all questions return on their own schedule. Legally, Serena filed nothing about Dr. Monroe because there was nothing to file. She documented the encounter and the letter, logged the surgeon's agreement to boundaries, and kept the record clean in case clean ever needed to be proven. Patricia updated the case note with the same neutrality she used to record height, weight, and bedtime. She reminded Adrian that identity is less a door than a set of windows. You decide which to open when, and some stay cracked forever to keep air moving. That week ended with the home evaluation rescheduled to accommodate a small flu that had traveled through the school like gossip. The evaluator, practical coat, kind eyes, clipboard with edges softened by use, walked the apartment. Without invading it, noting the ordinary evidence of care that matters more than speeches. The way the step stool didn't wobble, the way coats hung low enough for children. These hands, the way the rabbit always seemed to be near enough to be found without panic. She asked them to describe a typical day. Layla answered like a cartographer. Zuri answered like a mayor. Adrian answered like an architect, who had learned that load-bearing and love-bearing sometimes describe the same beam. When the evaluator left, she said something professional that still felt like a blessing, that the house knew its job. That evening, the three of them ate spaghetti that insisted on jumping off forks and laughed at the sauce's audacity. After bedtime, Adrian stood in the doorway as he always did, counted the breaths he did not need to count, and let the soft cone of the hall light confirm what the judge had insisted on, and the work had made true. Stability was not a pose, it was a practice. On the desk, the photograph of Owen sat beside the list that had grown from schedule to ethic. Adrian added a new line because the day had earned it. Welcome truth that arrives. Humbly, bar truth that arrives hungry. Keep the door latched and the table set. The city outside arranged its lights with the confidence of a place that has rebuilt itself before. Inside, the apartment kept its own lights exactly as bright as they needed. To be, no more, no less, so children could sleep and mornings could begin. Spring took hold with the stubborn confidence of a city that has memorized its own revival. Sidewalks shrugged off their scabs of salt, and the river flashed like it remembered it could perform. Inside the penthouse, healing began to behave like a practice rather than a hope. It showed up in ordinary places, how coats found their hooks without reminders, how piano keys accepted a second hand, how the hall light was left on for minutes fewer than yesterday because courage likes to be counted in small exact numbers. Adrian formalized the next layer of care. Patricia had recommended a clinician who understood grief that arrives too early and identity that arrives in pieces. Dr. Meera Patel, child psychologist, did not turn the first meeting into theater. She sat cross-legged on a rug, level with the girls, and ask questions that sounded like invitations to color. Her tools were quiet: a box of pencils with names written on the wood, a sand tray that remembered the shapes it was given, a set of emotion cards that reminded even adults that words sometimes need pictures to walk beside them. She did not pry, she made room. The sessions unfolded with the patience of a gardener. Zuri learned that worry can live in the body like a small animal and that breathing can coax it from hiding. She learned to place the rabbit when anxiety swelled so that its felt ear touched the center of her chest the way Dr. Patel taught her to place her hand. Layla, older and more vigilant, learned to name her need to check locks as love trying too hard. She practiced giving that love. Different jobs, choosing dinner, folding towels in the way hotels teach, so her vigilance could retire early some nights. Dr. Patel spoke to Adrian between sessions with the crisp humility of a professional who knows families are the true experts. She recommended rituals that do not preach, naming one thing each night that felt safe, one thing that felt brave, and one thing they would gladly leave behind in the dark. She encouraged him to narrate transitions out loud because children trust days that are narrated into shape. The household absorbed these practices without resistance. Each evening after dishes were stacked and the piano released a handful of notes, the three of them added their small offerings to a bowl on the counter: a word for safe, a word for brave, a word for done. Zuri often chose pancakes as safe and turning off the hall light for 3 seconds as brave. Layla offered quiet bus rides and telling Miss Alvarez, "I didn't need the door open all the way. Half was enough." Adrian admitted more than once that making a mistake and correcting it belonged in the done column as proof that perfection was not a requirement for belonging. School made its own demands. The liaison assigned by the principal wrote notes that were as practical as they were kind. Layla preferred corners to center tables for reading. Zuri focused best when a teacher knelt to eye level before giving instructions. The class rabbit, predictably named Clover, accepted gentle attention from Zuri and only bit once, which the teacher called a reminder that even soft things defend their edges. Art teachers returned home with paint on their sleeves. A librarian kept aside a crate of true story picture books after noticing that Layla sought narrative that admitted hardship and ended in competence. Adrian's leadership at work adapted and held. He compressed meetings into a late morning block and discovered, to his surprise, that clarity increased when hours shrank. He refused 3 gala invitations without an ounce of regret because applause had become a sound he no longer needed. He added a weekly sight walk with his operations lead at dawn when the city's steel rose out of mist like things newly decided, partly to keep his hands near the work that had always steadied him, partly so that by 8 he was back at the island pouring syrup with the steadiness the girls now borrowed. The legal scaffolding kept time in the background. Serena prepared for the 60-day review with the competence of someone who hates surprises and loves documents. Patricia visited with decreasing ceremony, finding in each visit the small evidence courts trust more than promises. School forms signed on time, pediatric follow UPS completed, a schedule posted low enough for small eyes to read. The evaluator's report arrived with words that felt like an earned breath: safe, predictable, responsive. The recommendation, concise and unambiguous, favored a transition from emergency guardianship toward permanent custody with an adoption plan to follow if the next review held steady. And yet the story never again pretended that safety was a straight line. A driver parked too long near the school gate one Tuesday and looked up at the building at the wrong moment. The security note amassed details: make, color, partial plate, and the building made a small adjustment. Staff posted themselves where they were needed without any flare of panic for children to catch. A package arrived without a return address. Serena's office opened it off-site and found nothing but a brochure as irrelevant as it was intrusive. The house did not cower. It tightened its own weave. Dr. Patel reinforced the rules, named the fact, adjust the plan, celebrate the return of ordinary. On a Saturday at the community center in Pilsen, the garden beds that had started as lumber became geometry. Layla measured and remeasured before driving a screw, not out of fear but integrity. Zuri, guided by a grandmother in a cardigan and an apron that smelled like cinnamon, planted peas gently and patted soil in a rhythm Dr. Patel would have recognized as regulation disguised as kindness. Adrian kept his hands busy and his presence unassuming, learning again what he'd already learned. Usefulness makes legacy. The envelope from Dr. Elias Monroe stayed where important things lived. Zuri sometimes took it out to trace its edge and returned it without fuss. Adrian kept his promise to share updates with Serena and Patricia, but filed nothing formal because there was nothing yet to decide. The surgeon kept his boundary promises. He sent one plain document, medical history useful to a child regardless of DNA, and then went quiet the way respectful people do when the next move isn't there. And there, in the symmetry of ordinary days and well-managed edges, time kept its side of the bargain. The 60-day mark appeared on the calendar like a threshold everyone could step across without tripping. The apartment, which had once felt like a gallery, now carried the wear pattern of family life. Scuffs on a baseboard from a step stool, a piano key that rang louder because little fingers loved it, a crayon mark on the underside of the island where someone practicing bravery had squeezed too hard. Healing, which had started as a wish, had learned the choreography of work. A door stayed latched to the past that tried to push through uninvited, and another door remained deliberately ajar to the future that would be allowed to enter only when the hearts inside were ready to greet it. Part 8. Reviews, reports, and the moment a house becomes a home. Family Court did not dress up for the 60-day review. It offered the same fluorescent hum, the same clipped names and docket numbers, the same layered fatigue in the waiting room where adults tried not to let children read their faces. What changed was the weight of the files Serena placed on the table: progress logs, school letters, the evaluator, his report, Patricia's measured notes, a schedule that had stopped being performance and started being fact. Stability travels poorly as rhetoric and beautifully as paperwork. Judge Margaret Ellis did not lean toward sentiment. She listened to Patricia's summary: attendance, medical follow-through, routines. That looked like care, not theater, and to Serena's quietly relentless chronology. She read the evaluator's words with visible approval and asked Adrian exactly 2 questions: what had been hardest and what had surprised him. He answered with a simplicity that courts respect. The hardest part had been giving grief time without trying to manage it out of existence. The surprise had been how much competence children bring when adults get out of their way and still stay near. The order extended custody beyond emergency status and set a path to adoption, contingent upon continued performance rather than intention. It dismissed Carl Whitaker's petition with prejudice, the paternity prerequisite unmet and now irrelevant, and continued the protective conditions as an acknowledgement that closings, even clean ones, deserve polite guardrails. The courtroom did not erupt. It sighed. That's how real victories often sound. At home, the effect was immediate in ways no one could have choreographed. Zuri slept through the night without leaving her room, waking with the stunned delight of someone who just discovered sleep can be trusted. Layla closed her journal, on top of the nightstand, not under a pillow. A small demonstration that secrets can be retired with honor. Adrian, who had kept his celebration habits quiet since the day the lake went still, bought 3 cupcakes from the bakery that drew rabbits on bags and placed them on the island without ceremony. The girls declared flavors, split frosting according to a treaty they invented, and the house for a long minute sounded like a place that knew how to keep joy. The rhythms deepened. Saturday mornings alternated between library and park, with detours to the garden where shoots began their disciplined climb, and Zuri cataloged leaves as if mapping a new alphabet. Evenings kept adding competencies: a dish washed well enough to earn applause, a shirt folded in thirds, a short scale on the piano that landed right more often than not. Layla volunteered to read aloud sometimes, her voice finding the steady music teacher's prize. Adrian found himself lingering not on the skyline but on the refrigerator door, where drawings evolved from a house on stilts to a house with roots, faint lines spreading like nerves or branches beneath a rectangle labeled in block print home. Dr. Patel layered in the next set of tools. She taught Zuri that big feelings could be poured into movement without spilling. Star jumps in 10s, wall pushes in 5s, until breath and body agreed again. She gave Layla language that dignified her role without loading her with duty. Not little mother, never that, but first witness, the one who sees the world first and reports back with accuracy. She told Adrian that his job was to keep being the most predictable thing in the room, a task both noble and unglamorous. He accepted the assignment. Work continued to cooperate with life. A groundbreaking Adrian might have flown to became a video call held at a quiet hour. A panel invitation slid into a folder labeled later without remorse. He started a practice he did not advertise. Each Friday, after the girls slept, he wrote a paragraph to Owen. Not as apology anymore, not as penance, but as record. What the week had been. What he had learned, what he had finally stopped trying to outrun. The paragraphs lived in a notebook he did not hide. Grief, properly honored, becomes furniture, useful, solid, capable of bearing weight. The month advanced. The principal called to say the school would host a community day, where families walked through projects that documented learning. Zuri prepared a display on plants that disguised themselves and announced cheerfully that she too could do camouflage by wearing all green and standing by the ficus. Layla curated a timeline of bridges and placed sticky notes that asked structural questions in tidy handwriting. Adrian attended in jeans and the kind of sweater that made him look less like a headline and more like the person he was learning to be. He listened to teachers who knew his children without making assumptions, and he came home understanding again that a city is built not just of beams and loans, but of eyes willing to see and hands willing to keep showing up. There were tests, as there always are. A rumor about Dr. Monroe reached the building through a neighbor who made a living by mistaking proximity for insight. The doorman passed it along, neutral as a memo. Serena checked the rumor against fact and found it empty. Patricia reminded everyone that gossip is simply wind with opinions. It can move curtains but not foundations. Adrian turned the reminder into practice. He named the wind, adjusted nothing, and let the apartment return to its resting heart rate. By the time summer hinted, the house bore the light scuffs and gentle dents that proved people lived there. The step stool had a line worn smooth from small hands. The hall light switch had become shiny under the patina of constant use. Even the rabbit, now a veteran with a notch in its ear and a reputation, held position like a sentinel rather than a crutch. The next hearing, adoption, final, definitive, found its date on the calendar. The line under it read, "Not win, but stand steady." That had become the family's way. Part 9. The hearing where promises become paper. The courthouse looked the same. The people inside it did not. Adrian entered as a man who had practiced steadiness until it looked like ease. Layla wore a blue dress and carried her journal as if wisdom were a thing you could bring to a bench without speaking. Zuri brought the rabbit because custom is its own law. Serena's briefcase weighed more than it had at the 60-day mark. But the weight came from confirmations rather than arguments. Patricia met them near the mural of scales and wheat and a child reaching for a star, nodded once and said, in the way of someone choosing every word on purpose, that the court was about to bless what the house had already proven. Adoption hearings are part ceremony and part audit. Judge Ellis, who had learned the family's cadence, ran the proceeding with that rare combination of formality and tenderness. Good benches know how to mix. Serena presented the file as a narrative made of facts: the emergency, petition, the home study, the extended custody, school records, medical follow-through, therapy progress, the evaluators concluding report that read like the word home, translated into bureaucratic. Patricia testified in lines spare enough to fit on a page: safety achieved, continuity sustained, siblings preserved, guardian responsive. She did not offer adjectives. The court supplied them by implication. There remained the matter of identity truth set in motion quietly months ago. Dr. Elias Monroe had, with careful counsel and under Patricia's protocols, pursued a paternity test only after Adrian and Dr. Patel agreed on timing and benefit. The test had confirmed what Denise's folder suggested. Biology pointed to the surgeon. He submitted a letter for the file that described his role as historian and resource rather than claimant. He requested no visitation order, only the court's acknowledgement that future contact would be governed by the family and the therapist, not by the courthouse clock. Serena included the letter without flourish, because good news that behaves is best left unadorned. Judge Ellis asked Layla if she wished to say anything. Children are never required to speak at such moments. The invitation alone can be a kind of vote of confidence. Layla stood with the economy of someone who has learned not to waste the room's attention. She said she felt safe. She said routines made the days make sense. She said Adrian told the truth even when it was awkward, and left the hall light on when asked and turned it off when asked again. She said they were ready to stop checking shadows first. Her voice did not wobble. When she sat, the rabbit's ear brushed her wrist as if to confirm. The judge turned to Zuri only to ask whether the rabbit needed to be sworn in. Zuri considered and declined solemnly, and the courtroom let itself smile. The judge turned to Adrian with the last necessary question, the one that binds the legal to the human. Are you prepared to be their father in every way the law can describe, and all the ways it can't? He did not attempt eloquence. He said yes and let the yes be the speech. The order pronounced what the apartment already practiced: adoption granted. New birth certificates would be issued in due course. Names would be recorded the way the girls wanted them read. The court recognized the ongoing involvement of a therapist and requested nothing more than the continuation of a life demonstrably working. Carl Whitaker's name, for the purposes of law, ceased to have any standing in the narrative. Dr. Monroe's role remained advisory, explicit in its boundaries, and generous in its patience. There were no balloons in the hallway. There were no journalists because Serena had structured the morning like a secret. There were 3 people and a rabbit standing under a skylight that made even municipal air feel special. Patricia shook hands without letting go too quickly. Serena allowed herself a rare joke about filing the best paperwork of her year. Judge Ellis, passing between matters, paused long enough to say that sometimes the smallest things carry the heaviest weight. A hall light, a schedule, a promise kept 70 times in a row. They went home not to a party but to a choice. Zuri elected pancakes for dinner because justice tastes better. With syrup, Layla opted for a library stop because permanence and books come from the same family. Adrian stood at the stove and burned cinnamon on purpose so the kitchen would smell like a holiday without requiring one. He did not give a speech. He handed out plates. Zuri declared the rabbit a judge and banged a spoon gently on the island to adjourn. The motion carried. That night, the hall light burned its calibrated cone, not as ward, not as test, but as ritual. An ordinary, humble ceremony that made the corridor glow the way a well-kept vow glows. Adrian walked past the open doorway and did not count breaths for long. He paused at the study and wrote one paragraph to Owen that did not hurt to write. He said the word home out loud, not because the walls needed to hear it, but because he did. Outside, the city rearranged its lights. Inside, paper had finally caught. Up to promise, and promise agreed to keep proving itself without end. Part 10. Years with weather, a letter's second life, and a house that knows its job. Summer quietly swapped places with fall, as it always does in the Midwest, and the family traded. Sandals for boots with the easy choreography of people who have survived seasons together. The house kept doing what it did best, absorbing noise without echoing it, welcoming. Routine without choking spontaneity, holding quiet without turning it into a test. Stability ceased to be the headline and became the air. The rituals acquired the patina time loves. Friday paragraphs to Owen stacked into a notebook and then another. Some weeks were no more than 4 lines and a date, a humility he would have been proud of. The community garden in Pilsen survived heat waves and thunderstorms. Layla's blue plank labeled river weathered into a tone a painter would call honest. Zuri learned to braid and insisted on trying the rabbit's ear as practice, until the ear, already legendary, took on a rope's dignity. The hall light retired from heroism and settled into symbolic duty. Many nights it never came on at all. The switch, shiny from use, waited without resentment for the few it did. Dr. Patel spaced sessions farther apart, then further, until check-ins felt like maintenance rather than repair. She taught Adrian the difference between surveillance and presence, and told him, with a clinician's dry kindness, that he had graduated from crisis management to parenting. He considered framing the certificate and decided, instead, to keep practicing. At school, the girls built their own reputations. Zuri emerged as a peacemaker in small conflicts and a tiny tyrant over glue sticks. Layla became the student teachers asked to read instructions aloud because her voice lent order to rooms. A science fair arrived like a parade. Zuri built a model of a house with roots and presented it as how to make a home hold on, and judges, professionals at hiding tears, asked careful questions and wrote high numbers. Layla mapped the city's bridges and coded a simple simulation showing the relationship between tension, compression, and trust. Adrian watched without correcting metaphors that did not need correction. From time to time, news from the periphery arrived and did not unsettle the center. Carl Whitaker faded in the way men without claims fade when courts stop handing them microphones. Dr. Monroe remained a quiet figure at the edge of the map. He sent 1 letter a year, short, seasonal, never coaxing, always permissive. And each lived in Zuri's box until she decided otherwise. When she turned 7, she reread the first. At 8, she asked Dr. Patel to sit with her while she read the second. At 9, she wrote back 2 sentences, a thank you for the medical update, about a family allergy, and a line saying that life felt full now. The boundary did not dissolve, it grew intentional. The surgeon replied with a postcard of the lake in winter, and a sentence about how ice looks solid long before it is, a warning disguised as a science fact. It was the right tone. The correspondence became a slow spine for a relationship that respected the life Zuri had chosen first. Adrian's empire did not collapse when its architect looked away from it more often. It matured. He stepped back from 2 boards and onto 1, where his presence made structures safer rather than shinier. He funded another garden and a small library program that trained student docents to give tours to seniors who had stopped believing cities wanted them. He declined interviews with a consistency that turned curiosity into boredom. The company's annual report included a page, small, sober, outlining pro bono projects. tied to housing stability, and a line that read, "Quietly, we build what lasts." No one in PR had to pitch it. On the anniversary of the adoption, the house performed no theatrics. It kept its appointments: pancakes, library, piano, a walk by the river where Layla and Zuri squinted. Into wind that always thinks it owns the day, and Adrian named Bridges without touching his phone. Back home, they pulled down a box labeled firsts and leafed through papers that had earned life in a fireproof place: 2 new birth certificates with names as the girls wanted them, the evaluator's final note, a printed copy of the court's order, a drawing of a house on stilts with a star above it, a later drawing of a house with roots and a star beside it, both labeled home in block letters that had grown from careful to confident. They added a new item, a photograph of the 3 of them on the couch, taken by the doorman James. On Community Day, the rabbit at attention, a banner in the background that simply read, "Welcome." Winter returned, because it is legally required to, and the apartment resumed its role as weather's rival. One night, Zuri woke from a bad dream and padded quietly to the study where Adrian was reading a book of city photographs that refused to glamorize. She climbed into his lap with the ease of someone who no longer asks permission for belonging. She asked, in a voice still catching up to her thought, whether their story belonged to the building or to them. Adrian answered in the economy he had learned. "To us," he said. He did not add, "and to Owen," and to everyone who helped, because the best truths sometimes travel better without additions. Zuri nodded, satisfied, and returned to bed without requesting the hall light. Years are a kind of weather too. They move through a house, rearrange small details, decide where will appear and where it will not. The step stool's handle gave up and was replaced. The piano acquired a lamp. The kitchen island bore a bruise only Adrian could see where a spoon had signed its own adoption order. The rabbit retired from active duty one spring afternoon and took up residence on a high shelf, not as sacred object but as veteran. When Zuri asked whether it felt wrong to put it there, Layla said, with the authority of a first witness, that retiring a hero was the best way to honor it. They left a ribbon looped around its ear so the house could always find its way back to that winter. The city kept evolving. A new public school opened in a neighborhood that had learned to mistrust announcements. Adrian attended quietly, shaking hands with custodians and crossing guards instead of electeds. The garden in Pilsen survived an early frost because volunteers covered the beds with tarps just in time. Bridges rose and fell on the river with their old mechanical modesty, then stayed up one morning because a flock of pelicans had decided Chicago was interesting this year. The girls grew taller, their questions kept getting better. The answers, mercifully, needed fewer words. On a late spring night, long after anyone could argue about paperwork, the envelope from Dr. Monroe made a second life for itself. Zuri, older now and practiced at choosing pace, chose to meet him briefly, in daylight, in a public place with Patricia's blessing and Dr. Patel's script tucked into the plan. Adrian sat at a nearby table with a cup of coffee and a magazine he did not read, close enough to intervene, far enough to let independence breathe. The meeting lasted 12 minutes. They talked about weather, science, and nothing that would bruise. When it ended, Zuri returned to the table, decided she preferred pancakes to more conversations. For the rest of the day, and the house, when they got home, made no more noise than usual. The door that had been left ajar years earlier had admitted a guest and closed itself without creaking. Boundaries, it turned out, could be both fence and welcome mat. The last loose ends disappeared not because they were forced to, but because being untied ceased to give them any leverage. Carl did not reappear. If he tried to tell the story in bars, the story refused him. The court file gathered dust in a way that counts as blessing. The photo of Owen remained on the desk, not as a test but as a member of the house. On certain nights, Adrian still wrote the Friday paragraphs. Not every week now, because sometimes silence also tells the truth. Layla began to annotate the city with a teenager's eye. Zuri began to teach Clover's successor at school how to enjoy being held. If a visitor had asked the house what it had learned, it might have said that families are built in smaller pieces than anyone likes. To admit, a light left on, then off, a schedule narrated, a drawing taped to a refrigerator with someone's whole heart behind it. It might have said that courts can bless what people have already proven, and that therapists can teach what love intends, that letters can arrive without blowing a window open, that biology can introduce itself without making demands, that grief, properly tended, becomes a foundation rather than a sinkhole. On the balcony one evening, with Jasmine climbing a trellis and the river catching a belligerent sunset, Adrian stood with the 2 girls who had found him in a storm and taught him not to run from weather. He named buildings without flourish and pointed at the places where the city had healed itself. Layla corrected one date because she had looked it up, and he accepted the correction with a smile. Zuri asked whether stars were colder than snow, and he said they were, infinitely. So, but that neither felt cold if you were with the right people. They went inside because dinner would not make itself, and the house did. What it had done since the day paper caught up to promise, it took their coats, held their laughter at a respectful volume, and kept the corridor bright enough for anyone who needed to find their way in the dark. The hall light, for once, stayed off. It didn't need to prove anything. The home knew its job, and the story at last knew its ending, not an exclamation point, but a steady line carried into tomorrow, written in the ordinary script of pancakes, piano practice, and doors that open when they should, and stay closed when they must. If a billionaire, with every reason to protect his own solitude, can step forward and change the course of two young lives, what does that say about the power each of us holds to notice, to act, and to love when it matters most? Share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this journey stayed with you the most? And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who believes in second chances and unexpected families. Thank you for staying with us through this emotional journey. Your time, your presence, and your reflections are what make stories like this come alive.